Well, this time next week, we'll be preparing to bring you all the news from the government's delayed federal budget. According to the Australian's Paul Kelly, the budget will set the ground rules for the next election. The central issue will be recovery and job creation, not the fiscal blowout. Paul Kelly joins me now from Sydney. Paul, you say that this is a transformation of the Liberal Party for a defined period of time into advocates for big and interventionist government pending the return, of course, of normality. Now, not many Liberal Party supporters on the centre-right would cheer at big government, but how confident are you that the Libs will go back to what their underlying philosophy is, you know, low tax and small government? And did they have any choice but to go down this route at this time?
I don't think they had any choice, Peter, as to how long it takes them to go back to their traditional position. Well, that's a very difficult assessment to make. I guess the point I'd make about the budget is that the budget reflects a new orthodoxy. It reflects the views of the Treasury, of the Reserve Bank, of the regulators, of the Prime Minister, of the Treasurer, of course, and that is that we needed a fundamental change in economic policy to respond to the recession, and we're seeing that in terms of very significant government spending, government intervention, a far more expansionary monetary policy, availability of credit, and of course what we'll see in the budget are big personal income tax cuts and investment support for the corporate sector. We'll also see, of course, enormous deficits and debt right across the forward estimates. The magnitude of this, the numbers, are just going to be staggering. And the really important point to make here is what Treasurer Josh Frydenberg said last week, and that is the debate is going to be about Keynesian demand stimulus, jobs and economic activity until we get the unemployment rate back comfortably below 6%. Well, that's going to be a few years away yet.
Today the PM made an announcement in part, I mean he's pitching into his big speech on Thursday, but $800 million, a digital assistance plan, really to boost a whole lot of services like agriculture, manufacturing, mining, logistics, enabling them to do business, I think, more efficiently. It's all about getting the conversation away from the health component of COVID into now economic recovery. But talk to me about the levers here, because so many of the levers about economic recovery are sitting with the states in the way they've got restrictions and obviously these border closures. How confident are you the PM now can drive this economic recovery alongside some resistance of populism from the states?
Well, the budget will have tremendous momentum. There's no doubt that the budget will be focused very much on Keynesian demand management and boosting activity and jobs. So that will have an enormous impact. One of the associated points to make is the point you just raised. That is that we're going to see a structural change in the economy towards a much greater emphasis on the digital economy. The government knows this. It committed those funds of $800 million towards the digital economy announced today. And of course we saw the new policy on the NBN announced last week. So those initiatives fit together. When it comes to the capacity of the premiers to thwart the government, well, a lot depends here on two things: what they do with their budgets and what they do with their borders. But we do see signs that borders are starting at the margin to open up, so that's going to be welcomed. It's very important that that momentum continue and that we do see the borders opening up in a far more substantial way over the next several weeks and couple of months. That is a really important requirement to open up the economy.
I want to ask you about something, and you'll know this man, he will be well known to you, Professor Gary Banks, formerly the chair of the Productivity Commission. He's written in The Australian, in your paper today, concerned over a growing deficiency in bipartisan behaviour and advice offered by the top bureaucrats in the country. Paul, Professor Banks singled out, obviously, Victoria in this article, saying that there's a most disturbing spectacle of all was the Three Monkeys performance by departmental heads at last week's hearings into the Board of Inquiry into hotel quarantine. But I mean, I've talked about it last night and I talked about it again today. I've looked through all the material now. I'm not saying there's not deficiencies here in the public service in Victoria, but I tell you what, I reckon they're being fitted up as the scapegoats in order to save the Premier and ministers like Lisa Neville. And in the end, if we want to talk about, you know, Westminster systems, there's also a thing called ministerial responsibility. Where's this headed?
Well, I think there are 2 points to make there, Peter. One about the public service, one about the ministers. Now, the article by Gary Banks, the former head of the Productivity Commission, in today's Australian is a really significant article. He knows the public service well, and what he's identified is a downward trend in the quality of public service administration in this country, which has really been underway for about the past 20 years. It's the politicisation of the public service. Gary Banks said that we're moving away from Westminster towards Washington, but we haven't got any of the checks and balances they have in Washington. So there's a real problem here with the public service. There's no question about that, and that is exposed in terms of the fiasco in Victoria. Having said that, we'll have to wait and see the final report of the inquiry. But to the extent that the inquiry is not going to make a finding against ministers, I believe that would be utterly untenable. And that would represent a very significant failure by this inquiry, whether that's to do with the terms of reference or whether it's to do with the quality of the inquiry. We'll have to wait and see. However, it's very clear, anyone who knows how governance in this country works knows that there has to be a sense of ministerial involvement and ministerial responsibility, either in terms of what they did or what they failed to do, and that needs to be identified. To the extent that it's not identified and the inquiry does not make a finding against ministers, then that is contrary to the way governance works in this country. I think it would defy credibility in terms of large parts of the Victorian population. It would bring the inquiry itself into, I think, a lot of concern and dispute about its own task, about its own job, and it would utterly defy common sense.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Paul Kelly, as always, thanks for your analysis. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.